Hello, everyone. So, I've decided that I'm going to tell people how to read polls. And I'm doing this because I have had well, 2 decades worth of experience in reading polls. Well, two and a half. But for about the first 5 or 6 years after being educated on how to read polls, I was wrong like, I don't know, 70 to 80% of the time. Couldn't figure out why. Because I was reading polls the way that we were taught how to read polls when I was taking my marketing, research, and, journalism related courses. And then I decided to use a different method. It's about shortly after the 2004 election. Because I realized that what I was doing was the same thing that the reporters were doing, and the reporters were all wrong. And so I tested my new process, and it's basically just a modification of the regular process on reading polls in the 2008 election, or well, 2006, and midterms, and then 2008, and then 2010 midterms, and 2012, and nearly every single time I was right. So I went from like a 70 to 80% failure rate to close to 100% success rate. It's a very simple model that I used. So what you're seeing here is the full polling report sheet for Wisconsin. And I'd like to take full credit for my method, but I actually learned it from a few talk show hosts on Air America, and one of them, Ronnie Reagan, right, the son of Ronald Reagan. Granted, Air America was a typically progressive radio station. They were trying to, syndicate, which was mishandled on so many levels. But the few people I listened to, including Ronnie Reagan, because remember, he grew up in a Republican strong family, and a lot of his family remains Republican to this day. So while his own personal beliefs may be progressive, he had some very cut to the point, intelligent ways of looking at things to predict how people were going to view certain results. It's not just him. I can't remember who else discussed this. I guarantee it wasn't Tom Hartman. I could guarantee you that much. Well, then I also looked into what some other people were saying, who were not on Air America, and some people who were typically Republican but tend to vote moderate. And they all had the same train of thought. And it's a train of thought where, regardless of what your political beliefs are, it tends to be true. First of all, there are very few polling companies out there that are slanted liberal. There are a few more polling companies out there that are slanted for conservatives or businesses. Now, you might say, well, how do you tell which is which? You tell that by knowing who finances the poll, first of all. So you need to do your own research. That's the first thing that you need to do. Find out who finances them. Find out the conditions under the financing of those polling agencies. And usually reporters are pretty good about reporting who does what. So anything by the Rand Institute, any poll by the Rand Institute typically is hard-leaning Republican. Rasmussen, so anything financed by the Rand Institute. The Rasmussen poll is typically financed by big businesses. I think at one point Rasmussen was financed by the Koch brothers, Koch. Anything that's financed by any sort of big business is considered either pro-corporate or pro-conservative. And then there's a lot of politics behind that, because a lot of pro-corporations make it appear as if they poll heavily for Democrat or liberal candidates. But if you look at the candidates' history, those candidates may actually be hardcore corporatists. They just have a blue sticker on their, or blue stamp beside their name, or donkey beside their name. And something I try to point out to a lot of people, the Democratic Party, like let's go back to Woodrow Wilson so I don't offend anyone. The Democratic Party was largely a conservative, pro-corporation party 100 years ago. They were for big bankers and big business. And that's why you have quite a few Republican mayors of New York City, right, or other outlying areas. So New York, if the Democratic Party in New York wasn't as pro-business as they were, New York would flip red. And so whenever anybody points out the scandals of Democratic candidates in New York, they're almost always caught up in big business, pro-business, a conservative slant. Because there were times when New York was very, even today, New York is very pro-business, and it's more than just Staten Island votes Republican. So there's like a whole thing going on in New York where New York could potentially be Republican depending on who was running for position and against what person in the party. And that's why you see a lot of strange political candidates operating in New York as a state over the last 100 years, right? So those are foundations there of determining which polling sectors are more moderate in their polling, which ones are more extremist in their polling, like really pro-liberal or pro-conservative, or pro-business. And it's funny because you will only see like red and blue that's on here because of our two-party system. But if there was a party that was solely pro-business, you would see three colors there. So you have to determine, it's like we're looking at this blue and red. It's like we're colorblind for purple, because there will be like let's say purple is the color for business. We don't see one here, so we have to know which one of these are pro-business as opposed to pro-conservative or pro-liberal. So that's the first stumbling block there. Another thing to determine whether or not it's a poll that you should listen to is whether or not they operate things called push polls. Push polls tend to, but not always, slant conservative or slant business. And the reason why they're so popular in slanting business or conservative is because push polls are funded primarily by lobbyists. However, I have come across not a lot, but a couple of push polling agencies that are like they're a weird liberal, like they're liberal and libertarian, right? Because liberal is close to the libertarian end. But they are usually smaller. They're usually less financed than the pro-big business or pro-conservative. Progressive polling, they typically want information as opposed to implanting information. Push polling is implanting information. And there are two ways to win an information war. One of them is to see what the people are saying, and the other way is to tell the people what they should say, or suggest to the people what they should say. Push polling is like hard suggestions. Here's an example of a push poll. Are you going to vote for the purple party, or are you going to vote for the party that hides pedophiles? Are you going to say to somebody over the phone, I'm going to vote for the party that hides pedophiles? No, you aren't. You're going to say, I'm going to vote for the purple party. By God, what's this pedophile thing? That's really not a made-up poll. I got something like that a couple of 2 years ago, and it was all in relationship to the Pizzagate thing coming out. It was by a smaller agency. Usually the bigger push polling agencies do not, are not that overt. But that was definitely an example of a push polling, agency. Any information you get from a push poll is bad information. Because I could call somebody up and say, are you going to vote for the rapist or the old man? Well, I'm going to vote for the old man. That information's useless. Because you have people who are conservative who are saying that Biden's the rapist, and they believe that Trump is an old man, but he's a good old man. Then there are people who say that, well, Trump is convicted in a civil court of being a rapist, and Biden is the old man. So you see, that is the type of polling that I'm talking about. Those types of push polls, they are useless. When you start removing these polls from the list, then you start to see actual friggin' numbers. So you remove the extremists, you remove the push polls. And if you need to know what an extremist one is, look at anything that is well above the norm. Like, let's say I can't even pronounce that one. I've never been able to pronounce it. I think I hear people call it Quinnipiac. But I know that I'm doing it wrong. This poll is almost always really hard for Democrats. Almost always really hard for that. And I have never seen it accurate. It's almost always off by like 2 or 3. This one from the actual voting. And then let's go all the way here. Oh, Marquette. Marquette is weird. Marquette never has stable numbers. Look, it went from +9 to a tie. I've never seen Marquette do a stable number. So let's go ahead and add giant fluctuations. If a poll is unreliable to a point where any one of their polls could read a massively different number, then they don't know how to handle the information they're receiving. They don't know how to properly segregate the population and address the actual people who are voting. So when you're doing polls, you have to you have to segregate the sources of all of the information. And by that, what I mean is man and woman, you separate those groups. Religious, non-religious, what kind of religion. So all these groups, they have to be segregated. And that's the only term you can use in your database. And if somebody says, well, that sounds like racial profiling, yeah, not just racial. It's also religious profiling, social profiling, gender profiling. That's what polls are. And the reason why this isn't really discussed when people read polls is because if you have a reporter out there saying, oh, well, we broke it up and we're segregating all of our information here. Well, first of all, segregation's a bad word, right? It's tied to one of the worst situations in human history. But it's also the only scientific word to use for what you have to do in order to read the polls correctly. And when a polling agency like Marquette is bouncing around by 9 points, something's wrong, because nothing else is bouncing around by 9 points. Absolutely nothing is bounced around 9 points. So it's +9, then a tie. And that is horrible. That's a horrible range right there. And then New York Times, Siena. New York Times is, well, I mean, they're a business. They're a big business thing. So, but they do tend to try to do their polling correctly. So basically what you have to do is you have to Remington Research. You'll wonder who sponsors this poll. So these two, the ends alone, Remington Research, anything that's out of the norm, I can't even pronounce that. Bloomberg is a big business polling. Bloomberg has often tried to influence polls. Sometimes Bloomberg gives correct polling. Other times, rich old Bloomberg himself says, I want the polls to be reading this, and then you'll see big swings. So you take away a lot of the big numbers, and you look essentially at the ones that are very similar to each other. Now, if everything here was 5 and above, that would be great. But if you're looking here, you have some weird results. Bloomberg Consult is like 5 off. Even given a month, that is wrong, because look how much Bloomberg is bouncing around. So Bloomberg doesn't know what it's doing. Now, if you look at something that is typically a right-leaning polling, like Fox News typically leans right, and you wind up with a tie, that usually suggests that how they lean is a little in the favor of the opposition individual. And look at this, Fox News, tie again, 4 months apart. So something here is saying that the situation with a right-leaning polling company 4 months apart shows no drift. Meanwhile, all these others show tons of drift, weeks apart. That's not going on. So there's a pattern here. People are not changing their opinions, which is weird. Bloomberg, again, bouncing around. 5, 4, 1, 1, 1. Something's wrong with Bloomberg. Bloomberg can't seem to predict anything, so they're bouncing all over the place. Emerson. So let's see Emerson. What's going on with Emerson? It seems to be holding steady at +3, favoring Trump. So you have clearly a major problem in how these guys are collecting polls, because everything is all over the place. That's when you have to look at what the methodology is. Because if this were nationwide polling, that'd be one thing. But no, it's Wisconsin, and you're seeing numbers all over the place. So, given the fact that there are some numbers that are not moving, Emerson does not seem to be moving. Emerson +3. Emerson +3. Fox, tie. Fox, tie. Let's see what CBS News. CBS News, pro-big business, +1 Trump. CBS News is often accused of being liberal or anti-Trump, but they're voting +1 Trump. So this suggests that things are just neck and neck. So it's not really +1 Trump. The available polling populace, this is how you read patterns. The available polling populace seem to be neck and neck. Cook political report, tie. Let's see, is there any other Cook here? I don't see another Cook here. But yeah, it's looking like everything that needs to be considered a tie, or everything that should be polling one way or another, is polling a tie. So CBS News and Fox News, they're giving the best indication here that people who are answering the phones are about neck and neck. So then what you have to say is, okay, so who are the people who are not answering the phones? And you compare that by looking at the voting behavior of the people in Wisconsin. People in Wisconsin who don't answer the phones typically are 2/3 split. 2/3 leaning into wherever the original polling began. So where was the original polling? Original polling down here, heavy for Biden. Ignoring, of course, Marquette, right? Ignoring Marquette. Bloomberg, and if you go down to the original polling for Biden, ignore Marquette, everything is within 2 and 1. Everything. But they're all blue. So, virtually, though, this is a tie. Marquette, New York Times, Bloomberg, Emerson. However, Wisconsin in the past, the non-polled electorate voted blue. So you take the 2/3 rule with Wisconsin, and essentially that's how it was. Like 2/3 for Biden, 1/3 for Trump. So that leaves a 1/3 margin in favor of Biden over Trump. That's Wisconsin's voting past. And you apply it to what you see up here. And what we see up here is two conservative ones giving Trump 5 and 6, so ignore those. And then you look at these, and they're all within about the same margin over the middle of the road result. And that was the middle of the road result was established by CBS News and Fox News. And they paint them as basically a tie. So what we have here is a very tight race for Wisconsin, with the unpolled electorate likely going to be 2/3 in favor of Biden. So let's add up these guys, and let's see if, basically everything is within margin of error right now. So it's so tight, you likely can't say with certainty. But it looks like it's going in one direction. So what's 2 + 3 + 3? That's 8. 8 total points. 3 divided by 8. So 0.375, 0.38. 38% is in favor of Biden, while 62% is in favor of Trump for the polled electorate. Using the 2/3 rule for Wisconsin and how they, for the unpolled electorate, how they tend to vote, you can predict that 66% are going to vote for Biden and 33% are going to vote for Trump. So that puts Biden at 1.035. You add them together, and then that would put Trump at what's 33 plus 62. So that's 9.95. So the margin would be the likelihood of Biden winning 1.035 over Trump's 0.95. That's a margin of 0.085, 8.5% in favor of Biden. That's how you handle reading polling. And in using my figures, it requires a lot of research and a lot of knowledge. So I'm always looking at polls. I'm always looking at what things are. And you break some things down into generalities, because polling is all about generalities. You subtract and get rid of things that are ridiculous, like Marquette. Marquette is not trustworthy. Fox News may be conservative, but CBS News is pro-business, not necessarily pro-Democrat. They're pro-business. It's a difference. And Trump is not a good businessman. That's why CBS doesn't really like him. But even they are predicting a tie. And when I do the unpolled electorate evaluation, I'm coming up with 8.5%, which is almost within the margin of an automatic recount. But it's just above the margin of error of 5%, 5 to 6%. I always consider 5 to 6% the margin of error, not just 4%, although I might say 4%. I always consider anything below 5 or 6 to be a margin of error. 8.5% is pretty close to the margin of error. And so this is the reality here of how to read polls correctly. So that's what I'm saying. Wisconsin, giving these poll numbers and ignoring the extremist numbers and knowing what I know about the electorate, the unpolled electorate you can only give a generality for. It's either 2/3, 3/4, or 3/5. Those are the best ways to view unpolled electorate. And 1/2. Those are the best general numbers to use. In Wisconsin, typically, more often than not, is 2/3. A 2/3 split for unpolled electorate. But you also have to listen to what the people are saying. Like an unpolled electorate, if they're really pissed off, somebody who never takes polls before, they'll appear before a reporter and say, I never answered these polls, but I got to tell you why I'm really upset about something. I gave a bad accent just so you knew it was not me. Somebody who says that, you need to immediately listen to them. And if they say, I don't like extremism, I don't like this, but I got to tell you what's affecting my family, that's when you need to listen to it. Whichever candidate listens to what that person says is the candidate that's going to win that unpolled electorate's vote. The message has to be more than just lip service, which means that message has to have been a consistent thing along the campaign. So for more than 5 months, if the politician only says it like for 3 out of 5 months and then they drop it, you never hear from it again, that politician has lost that person's vote. That's how you read the unpolled electorate. You have to look for the case examples. Biden has been consistent about his message to Wisconsin. And he says the things that Wisconsin voters want to hear. When Trump goes to Wisconsin, he mixes his message up with a bunch of other weird, nonsensical messages that have nothing to do with what Wisconsin wants to hear. And so if you mix your message up with something that a person in Wisconsin doesn't want to hear, they're not going to pay attention to you. But he'll still get like 1/3. That's why I say he's got like 1/3. If he were as consistent as Biden, then he would have one half. Biden would have one half. And then you would be down to a split of maybe a margin of 4% or less. But you don't. So that's why Wisconsin has the 2/3 rule in regards to Biden and Trump. Now, this is a lot easier than any other election, typically, because most other elections, you have people who are unfamiliar with the candidates. But these people are familiar with both candidates from two separate elections. So that's how you read polling numbers. And I wanted this to be put out there so people understood what I'm looking at. And by the way, look up here. The polling has Trump, and the average is 2.6 above Biden. Well, they're including the bad polls here and here, right? And Bloomberg. So you take those out, and see, they're including Bloomberg, and Bloomberg is listed like 4 times. And Trump still only has a margin of 2.6%. That's well within the 4-point margin of error. So they're considering all of these bad polls. But even then, the bad polls are kind of averaging out. This is going to be a tight race in Wisconsin. So if Wisconsin, we'll see if my polling calculations are correct. Because every time a new series of polls are released, I look at the new polls, but there isn't much deviation from the polls that are steady. So if there is a bunch of deviation closer to election day, then we'll see. But as of now, I think that anywhere between 4 and 10%. That's where I have 8.5%. It's almost right in the middle between 4 and 10%, right? Actually, it's between 6 and 10%. So between if either, if we were to have the election now, or if the numbers stay steady, we'll see if my prediction on the unpolled electorate pans out. It may be wrong. It's just I have had a pretty strong success rate since 2004, ever since I adopted this new method of evaluating polls. And but even then, like I said, my 8.5% prediction is so close to the margin of error, and we'll see closer to November if these types of polls here. See, I hate Bloomberg. +3 Biden, after bouncing around to +1 Trump, after +5 Trump, +4 Trump, +1, then +9 Biden. Nobody makes decisions like this. Bloomberg is so screwed up. Bloomberg is so screwed up. So let's say I'm going to adjust it even more. I'll adjust it even more down to saying that my prediction is 5%, not 8.5%, but 5%. Let's say I'm 5% with the unpolled electorate voting in favor of Biden. That's still so close that it could easily go to Trump. Because I'm not comfortable with any figures that are under 10%. I'm just not. Because you have to make a general assumption with the unpolled electorate. But we'll see how good my numbers are come November. And we'll see if things keep flipping back and forth. This is why nobody should trust Bloomberg. He's a businessman, and his polls reflect his business attitude. Anyway, that's it. Thank you for listening. I hope you learned something. And, have a wonderful day. Bye.